Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Primetime. Primetime is a Bethel Library program that's a collaboration between the Friends of the BU Library, Academic Affairs, and other offices on campus that celebrates learning in and beyond the classroom of Bethel faculty, students, and staff. Thanks for joining us. Coming up on Thursday, May 18th, Dr. Min-Young Lim, Assistant Professor of Social Work, will share her study of lived experiences of Burmese refugee college students for settlement and the role that social support plays in their experience. And that will be the last prime time of this academic year, so you don't want to miss that. Today, Nick Zeimet, Director of Field Education and Assistant Professor of Social Work, will share how junior social work students were placed in BIPOC community agencies as part of a social work pilot in community engaged learning. Please welcome Nick.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm excited about next week's prime time, so I'm just gonna pitch that. Make sure you come next week. That sounds like not that I'm biased in any way towards the social work department and our professors, but you need to make time in your week next week as well. Thanks for being here. I've been pretty excited about what we've done this year in our social work department and in this pilot first time experience to redesign the pre-field experience that our junior students do. And so today is just want to walk you through a little bit about where that redesign came from, why we did a redesign, what it looked like. I think I mentioned this last year when I did a primetime. I'm trying to learn what it is to be an academic, so I don't have outcomes. I don't have these things yet. Maybe next year I'll have some outcomes that I can report to you. But this year I just want to talk about where this project came from, what our students did, maybe some of the things that they learned throughout the year, what our community partners have said as well. So, engaging in anti-racist work. I want to start just by grounding us a little bit to social work. So, social work is a competency-based profession, meaning our students are coming to classes every day and they are learning content which they need to learn, and they need to demonstrate that they understand the content in the classroom. But the social work profession is about demonstrating practice. It's about interpersonal work. It's about me showing up with another human being and able to engage with that human being to help them progress their life situation in whatever way that they need to. So our students need to be able to demonstrate their competent practice in a field agency out in the community. And so that's important. It's important that we know that social work is competency-based. We'll talk just real briefly in this presentation. I'll just mention briefly about social work's history and really about social work's racist history. And it's important as a profession, as an education program, and as students going through this program that we recognize the role social work and social workers have played in how our profession and our professionals within the profession have been complicit in some of the practices and policies and structures and systems and the ways that individuals and families have shown up and some of the stressors they have faced as they try to do just their own daily living and progress towards well-being. I'll mention a little bit just our community context. Why this work is especially unique for Minnesota, especially unique and necessary for Minneapolis-St. Paul. And then again, we'll get into the community learning pilot this year. And we'll have a couple thoughts about our community partners. Anti-racist work, it takes courage. My wife and I attended a rally at the Capitol back in February. Early February was the 1 year anniversary of the killing of a young man named Amir Locke in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And on the 1 year anniversary, there's a rally in the rotunda at the Capitol. And in this rally, Amir Locke's niece, couldn't have been more than 7, 8 years old, took the microphone and led those gathering in this place of law and power, led those that were in attendance, those were watching live on Facebook, in some chants, declaring her uncle's name. And then just with great courage, she sang a song. And I was gonna just ground that because it takes a lot for a young black girl to stand in a place of power like the Rotunda in St. Paul, and to claim the name of her uncle, and then right after that to be claiming that her God is a miracle maker, way maker, and did that in song. And it's just such a powerful moment of courage. And so when I think about the courage it takes to do anti-racist work, I think about this 7-year-old black girl, and if she is able to stand in a place of power and do these things, then this old middle-aged white man certainly, who has very little to lose, can definitely do this as well. And I encourage you all to find courage to do this hard work.
Okay, let's go, Zuri. All right.
Amir Locke, what's his name?
Amir Locke!
Amir Locke, what's his name?
Amir Locke!
Say his name.
Amir Locke.
What's his name?
Amir Locke!
Say his name.
Amir Locke!
What's his name?
Amir Locke!
Say his name.
Amir Locke!
You are here, moving in our midst. I worship you. I worship you.
That's right.
You are here, turning lives around. I worship you. I worship you. And you are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are.
Yes! Sing it!
And you are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. And you are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are.
Yes! Good job!
Even though I don't feel when you're working, even though I don't feel when you're working, you never stop working, you never stop. Jesus, you are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are.
Justice for Amir Locke.
I'm very much aware of my social disposition. I carry lots of privileges. In the work that I do, I'm able to say and do and put myself in positions that others just aren't able to do. I recognize that. I also recognize I've got lots of blind spots in my understanding of what is going on in our world and the experiences people have. So I come to this work with probably not as much awareness as I oftentimes should of my own experiences as a white, heterosexual, cisgendered, married Christian man. I want to bookend our presentation with a couple different scriptures. So this first scripture, Luke 4:16 through 21, this is Jesus going into the temple early on in his ministry, and he takes the scroll, and here's what the scripture says. He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him, and he began by saying to them, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." And I want you to hold those words from Isaiah as we get to the end. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, and to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. All right, so we already talked about social work. It's a competency-based profession. Just real quickly, there are 9 competencies that social workers have to practice, they have to learn, they have to practice, they have to demonstrate for a licensed social work supervisor in a practice field, and then they are evaluated on that. Are they competent, not competent, and there's varying levels of this. So these social work competencies, the first is ethical and professional practice. The second is to engage in diversity and difference in practice. The third is to advance human rights and justice issues. The fourth is to engage in practice-informed research, research-informed practice. The fifth is engaging in policy practice. And then competencies 6 through 9 are about direct practice work. It's the engagement, assessment, intervention, and evaluation with clients. In social work, we define clients as being an individual, a group, a family, a community, and or an organization. So the competencies are established by the Council of Social Work Education. This is the accrediting board for schools of social work, and those competencies are reviewed, revised, updated every 7 years. So these competencies, there we go, are from 2015. So last summer, 2022, CSWE revised the social work competencies. Most of them are remaining the same. However, competency 2, the engagement in diversity and difference in social work practice, has been revised. It's been updated to this new competency: engage anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion in practice. Currently, we are still operating as an undergraduate program under the 2015 competencies. They give you some time to update your curriculum, update your program to these new competencies. But this is where we're going. We're quite excited because we feel like most of our program is already here. And so I think there's going to be little updates and additions that we have to do to our curriculum. So again, we're going to have to be in alignment with these new sets of competencies over the next couple of years. All right, let's see if I can do all this now. So we're going to transition out to social work's racist history. So CSWE, again, the board, the accreditation community that accredits our program. CSW acknowledges harm done to Indigenous and tribal peoples. This is the statement out by the Council of Social Work Education. You can see August 5th, 2021. We all know this history before August 5th, 2021. You could probably in your mind do some timeline, some history as to why at certain dates all of a sudden places are starting to acknowledge and make statements and get things on paper as far as acknowledging sins of the past of some of the organizations and governing boards, right? So this came out August 5th, 2021. Again, I'm just going to read here. Acknowledging harms done to Indigenous and tribal peoples. Right in here, you'll see this statement of acknowledgement was created for educators to use as a resource in social justice, racial inequities, and social work curriculums. We hope that this apology not only helps to heal our relationships with Indigenous and tribal peoples, but it helps educators and students to work with these communities in the future. Again, this comes from a place of the role social workers played in removing children from homes, the role that boarding schools played, and how social workers oftentimes were the acting forces of that. There are stories, documented narratives of people seeing cars pulling up to houses, family members telling children to go hide, just the fear that was created in homes, all under the umbrella of a value judgment about families and how you're raising children and what's appropriate and what's good and what's the right way to do things, and the separation of families. So CSWE acknowledges. NASW is the association, it's the largest association of social workers in the United States. The National Association of Social Workers apologizes for racist practices in American social work. So for instance, NASW talks a little bit more. So you'll see up here for progressive era social workers built and ran segregated settlement houses. Social work suffragists blocked African Americans from gaining the right to vote. Prominent social workers supported eugenic theories and programs. Social workers helped recruit black men into the infamous Tuskegee experiment, the medical such. Social workers participated in the removal of Native American children from their families and placement in boarding schools. Social workers also took part in intake teams at Japanese internment camps during World War II. And then lastly, and since the founding of the profession, bias among social workers has limited delivery of healthcare, mental health treatment, and social service delivery to people of color. So our large associations, governing boards within social work, I should have pointed out maybe the date of this as well. Again, June 17th, 2021. So again, none of these things are new. As social workers, as social work educators, the profession has always been aware of the acts. And again, in your mind, you can do, what's the timeline here? 2021, what's going on? Why are people making these statements all of a sudden in 2021? So social work history. It's important. Again, we have started to incorporate acknowledging these things in our introduction to social work. The work that we do in our pilot also talks about grounding. This is why we're doing the work we're doing. This is why it's important for us to be aware. It's because we will be presenting ourselves to communities that have very little trust and very little goodwill towards you as an identified social worker. And we need to understand why that is. And so this is just a little bit to talk about why that is. All right, so community context. We want to talk a little bit just about Minnesota, and I'm going to talk even further. Again, we talked about the year 2021, why that is significant. We know in the spring of 2020, George Floyd was murdered in the city of Minneapolis. We know that in the spring of 2021, less than 5 miles from where George Floyd was murdered, Daunte Wright was murdered in the city of Brooklyn Center. And again, that was 2021. The winter of 2022, a young man, Amir Locke, was murdered in his home by Minneapolis St. Paul Police Departments, issuing a no-knock warrant going into that home. 2 of the 3 have those cases have progressed to where there were charges, and that progressed to a due process in court. 1, no charges were pressed in that situation. So that's recent history. There's more history beyond those 3, but just from the year 2020 to now, this is happening in our backyard, in our neighborhood, Minneapolis, St. Paul. I did a little exercise over the J term, taught a reconciliation class. I did a quick little informal survey and asked students, how many of you in your churches heard the name George Floyd mentioned the Sunday or 2 after his murder? 100% of the hands went up. Every single church was talking about George Floyd after his murder in 2020. I asked how many of the churches that you all go to, for those who go to church, did you hear the word, or not the word, did you hear the name Daunte Wright said in your church after Daunte Wright was killed a year after? And probably about 2/3 of the hands went up. Less, but still the majority of the hands went up. There's still a concerted effort, especially in spiritual religious spaces, to be talking about the murder of young black men in our community. I asked a 3rd time then, so last year when Amir Locke was killed, how many people heard Amir Locke's name mentioned in your church? In 2022, there was 1 hand that went up out of a class of 25. And we'll get to this in a little bit about what time does for us in our attention to injustices and harms being done in our community. So even more, community context. Social indicators of racial disparities in Minnesota are among the worst in the nation. You may have heard this, I don't know, and I probably should have had a quote here. Minnesota is a great place to live. Who wants to finish that sentence for me, right? Minnesota is a great place to live if you are white. Minnesota oftentimes ranks amongst some of the top surveys about places to live in our country, okay? And education is great in Minnesota, if you can fill in the blank for me. Healthcare is great in Minnesota, if you can fill in the blank for me, okay? So it's often quite surprising to people when they hear about how Minnesota ranks amongst, within the country, when we talk about these social indicators, and we break it out for race. And so you see Minnesota number 48 out of 51, if you include DC, when we talk about racial integration. We're talking about indicators, again, of employment and health. And let me do a reverse here so I don't have to keep scrolling that out. So when it comes to employment and health, 48 out of 51. When we talk about education, 48 out of 51. When we talk about social and civic engagement, 43. And then we talk about health. This is probably the only thing that's saving us from not being lower than 44 is health. We do have a higher ranking in health. And again, this is having to do specifically with how is our non-white population performing, how are they showing up, how are they being affected in these different indicators. So that's what's going on in Minnesota. It is a great place to live for some of us. Continued indicators of racial disparities in Minnesota. So again, this is just in Minnesota. This is NPR. Again, we're looking here shortly after the murder of George Floyd, so the summer of 2020, and we see some of the indicators on here. So we see, now we can see some of these numbers about when it comes to wealth gaps that exist. The median black family in the Twin Cities, 38,000, which is less than half of the median white family income. We see how the pandemic affected people differently. The black poverty rate in the Twin Cities is 25.4%. White poverty rate, 5.9%. 3/4 of white families owning homes, 1/4 of black families own homes. In 2019, the point behind that, the incarceration rate of black individuals in the Twin Cities was 11 times that of white individuals. Underneath that, the state of Minnesota has one of the nation's worst education achievement gaps between the black population, white population. In 2019, it ranked 50th when it comes to racial disparities in high school graduation rates. It's important for our students, all of our students, but as a predominantly white institution, it's important for us to have a conversation and to talk about how Minnesota is a great place to live. There's a lot that's going on in Minnesota, but we really do need to have an honest conversation about how it's a great place for certain people in certain ways, and we need to be talking about this. So, social work, some data here. Again, context of the state of Minnesota. According to the Minnesota Department of Human Services, 92% of Minnesota social workers were white in 2019. I believe our data for the state of Minnesota has our white population at something around 82, 83%, something like that. In the metro area here, I do some field seminars for our social work classes, again, where they're going into the community and they're supposed to be demonstrating, practicing their social work competencies. It is not uncommon for students to be at schools in the metropolitan area where the majority of the population of students are of non-white racial status. And so our elementary schools especially are incredibly diverse. And 92% of the social workers interacting with this student population are white students. I didn't get a chance to put in, and when I say I didn't get a chance, I mean I just didn't do it, and I should have. I'm working on accountability and accepting things. So part of the history here of social work also should talk about how do social workers get licensed. Social workers become licensed through graduation from accredited universities, and then they need to take an exam. And it's the passing of this exam that actually unlocks for them licensure. So we have students that will graduate, not from our college, of course, but from other maybe institutions. But we have social work students who will graduate a social work program, have demonstrated competent social work practice in the field to another supervised licensed social worker who may not see licensure because they cannot pass the exam. And it probably is not a shocker, because I'm bringing it up in this presentation to say that there is great disproportionality in who is passing these exams. And so across the country, non-white, non-English speaking potential social workers are having a greater difficulty passing these exams. And so when we talk about 92% of Minnesota social workers being white in the state of Minnesota, we have a problem at our exam level as well that, again, as a profession, hopefully we're trying to address. In addition to just some of the data, here's what probably most strongly influenced myself to really want to push for doing something different in our junior pre-field experience. Not only were some of the local police violent interactions with communities of color in the last 2 to 3 years significant for me, but the other part that was significant was just hearing some local expert voices talk about some issues within our community. So the first, Resma Menachem. Resma Menachem is local to the Minneapolis Twin Cities area. He's a social worker, a psychotherapist, educator, trainer. He's a New York Times bestselling author. You probably if you know of him, you probably know of him through his book, My Grandmother's Hands. Resma Menachem he's made this statement that says that the white body is the standard in our society, in our culture. And any deviation from the white body is seen as unacceptable in our culture. And for himself, this explains some of the great deviations that we see in our education system, in our healthcare system, in our community policing systems and practices, in child protective service areas, that any deviation, any standard to whiteness is judged and is devalued, and is a source of great pain and shame for many communities. Not that this is true, this is the experience in our communities, right? This is how social workers or police officers or teachers, from this person's perspective, this is what's happening, is we've got a standard that we're judging others by, and that standard is not appropriate to how families are showing up for themselves.
So when we talk about the white body being standard, right? You don't have to think about these things. These things, your life will be fine if you don't have to think about these things. However, my black body, I cannot survive this society without understanding these things, the idea of race and racialized concepts, both overt and covert. There is no way that my people could have survived by just going, okay, it's over. Wait a second, it's over. Let's just keep moving. But part of the privilege of a white body, and part of the privilege of developing the system based on the white body, is that white people don't really have to think about it. It is not incumbent. Your survival is not dependent on you knowing the nuance of race.
The other voice that was really significant for me was the voice of Nikema Levy-Armstrong. Nikema Levy-Armstrong is a civil rights attorney. She's the former president of the Minneapolis branch of the NAACP. She is the founder of the Racial Justice Network. I should have put on here, she's also a children's author as well. This really caught me. Last fall, if you all recall what was going on in Minneapolis last fall, it was an election season, And in Minneapolis, the big question was, should we defund the police, essentially, or I'll just kind of paraphrase here, but it was reimagining the public safety service delivery in the city of Minneapolis. And this was going to the voters. I think it was question number 2 on the ballot last year. And so people were really looking for her voice on this. What is your thought about this? Defund the police, not defund the police, just to paraphrase, right? And so she came on and did a Facebook Live where she answered this question. I logged on, and in my naive way was looking for a 3-minute answer so I could hear it and I could move on and I could just file it away, right? 53 some minutes later, right, she's kind of wrapping up her answer because it's incredibly nuanced, right? One of the things I started to realize, like, I want really clean, simple answers, right? Tell me what to do, tell me the right thing, tell me what we need to do moving forward. And this is incredibly complex. It's incredibly nuanced. But in her answering of this question, there was about a 5-minute segment where she talked about social workers. And she talked about social workers because the conversation, our president said it during campaign cycles. The reason she talked about social workers is because one of the proposals was, let's divert some of this money towards social workers, towards mental health professionals, to people who can go out into the community, who have been trained to handle some of the reasons police are called to the community in the first place: domestic violence, substance use, mental health crises, other situations that unnecessarily escalate because of the situation being presented. Our police officers may or may not be trained for that, so let's send out people trained. And it sounds like a wonderful solution. It sounds like a great idea. Again, by somebody who thinks that Minnesota is a wonderful place to live, right? That sounds great to me. I educate social workers, and I'm like, yes, they should be called out on these cases because I know they are getting some good education and they're showing up with really a nuanced understanding of what's happening in this situation. But for Nikema Levy-Armstrong, that was not reassuring to her. And as she was talking about social workers, she definitely acknowledged that some social workers are very ethical, and they are culturally competent, and they can provide culturally responsive services, and they should be showing up in some spaces. However, she was also very honest in saying that's not her experience, though, with all social workers. And the words that still ring in my mind as I thought about being here and training social workers and educating social workers and having a voice in social work education and people shaping their own professional identity, is she said, these so-called professionals, and these were her words, she said, these so-called professionals and their disdain for Black and brown families. And that was based off of her experience of being in a courtroom with individuals who are trying to either just put up a defense, which everybody has a right to, or being present with someone who felt like their rights had been encroached upon, being in the courtroom as an advocate, as a professional for someone who was fearful their family would be separated. And her words were these so-called professionals. And it was at that moment where I kind of committed myself, as much as I'm able to not be a part of educating so-called professionals. I'm very proud. I just got done with some case presentations in our field seminar class. I'm very proud of our social workers and how they are thinking about and presenting their cases, because there's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of conversation and thinking about what are the systems and structures, what are the biases that are taking place in a situation that I need to be aware of and might just have happened in this person's life before they even showed up for me. This all is going on in our community. It's all weighing heavily on me, and I'm trying to think, what can we as a department, as an institution, as a program do?
I've heard so many promises thrown out about what will happen when the city council gets control of the public safety budget. And they're going to create this new office and have social workers working alongside cops and working alongside mental health professionals. And I am all for taking a holistic approach, because I do believe that taking a holistic approach can save lives. However, I also understand the fact that we are locked inside of a system and a situation in which white supremacy is very pervasive. You have social workers, several of whom are good people that do good work, that care about the people that they're serving, that went into such a noble profession with a sense of honor and dignity in mind for themselves and for the people that they're serving. You also have social workers who unfortunately have done a lot of harm. And we need look no further than what's happening with our child protection system and the impacts to Black families and Native families of white social workers making decisions without having any real cultural competency or sense of understanding about the dynamics that happen in our community that fuel poverty, addiction, and some of the other things that are happening to people. Instead of people getting the help they need, culturally competent support and services, a lot of times we're seeing our children being ripped away from their families and placed with strangers. And all that does, unfortunately, is keeps the cycle going. And it makes it more likely that those young people are going to wind up in the juvenile justice system, in a gang, and in the adult criminal justice system. I'm saying this as someone who has studied this issue back when I was a law professor and looking at the war on drugs and all of the collateral consequences that have flown from the war on drugs. I'm also saying this as an attorney who has been in the courtroom representing Black families who have been caught up in these cycles and seeing the attitudes amongst some of these so-called professionals and their disdain for Black families. Now, I'm not saying this is the case for all social workers. There might be some social workers watching this feed who are like, I'm not like that. I love all people. Well, I'm glad for you. If that's your mindset, that's your mentality, you're helpful to families, you're culturally competent, I support and I applaud you. But you also know that you may have coworkers, supervisors, and other people who you have worked with who do not share your perspective and who do not value Black families. So imagine with those issues unresolved, you have additional white professionals all under one roof working alongside the police force and whatever it will look like. Because even if this amendment passes, there will be police. I don't know how they're going to address 911 calls that maybe don't call for a social worker or a mental health professional without having someone there who can address whatever the situation is, right? And I am saying this as someone who has consistently called out Minneapolis police, the Department of Public Safety, Hennepin County Sheriffs, Ramsey County Sheriff, on and on and on for their behavior, which I do not condone, I do not accept, and I have significant problems with what's going on. So knowing that there are going to be police and knowing that there is a push to eliminate the minimum requirement for the number of police, the question is, what is that going to look like? I have no problem with us looking at the charter and making adjustments, using research and evidence-based practices to make a decision about what that staffing number needs to be. But we have to have a lot of trust to believe that the people who are in those seats now and those who might be in those seats after November 2nd will exercise due diligence and actually make decisions that are in the best interest of all residents of Minneapolis, and particularly the ones who are suffering most at the hands of folks in the community who are engaging in violence and at the hands of the police.
All right, so I've got like 7 minutes left or something, so we'll actually get to the pilot, right? So our department said it's very important that we model the competencies in our department. Engaging in ADI practice, advancing human rights, engaging in justice work, engaging in policy practices and policies that disadvantage some over others, that sort of a thing. So we said we need our program really to mirror these competencies as well. So we redesigned our junior level field experience to be and experience an ADI social work practice 1 and 2. It's a year-long practice experience. Again, ADI, it's now a competency of social work. Our social workers have to demonstrate that they can practice anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion in their practice. So what we said is we went from 180 hours down to 150 hours. They always had to do some sort of community engaged practice in their junior year. We went to 150. It's still in the community. At the junior level, because it's a pre-field, those students do not need to necessarily be under the supervision of a social worker. They do need to have supervision, somebody helping them to know what to do and what the practices are and just how to be professional and ethical in the space. But what we wanted to focus on was we wanted to be really intentional about what their community learning was going to be and in what kind of setting it was going to be. So we have identified that we want them to be immersed in an agency, an organization, a community group that is organized, led by a person of color, somebody who is Black, somebody who's Indigenous, a person of color. Because whatever our own identifying social positions are, there is a dominant narrative that exists within our country, within our society, and we need our students to be immersed in a counter narrative. We need them to be hearing the experiences of a Resmaa Menakem, of a Nikema Levy-Armstrong, who have thoughts about what is their experience with social workers, what is their experience with teachers, what is their experience with professionals, and to have that to be brought in. So under the direction supervision of a BIPOC leader. They do still take a corresponding seminar class, and in this corresponding class, we talk about things like white supremacy. We talk about things like oppression. We talk about things like colonialism and colonial practices. We try to differentiate between helping and advocating. We don't want to perpetuate a system where, as a professional, we believe we know what the intervention of somebody within somebody's situation needs to be. We want to really ground ourselves in coming alongside, listening to, learning to, in our competencies. One of the behaviors that our social workers have to demonstrate is how they are allowing the individual, the family, the group, the community they are working with to be the expert of their own life situation and circumstance. We bring in some of the social work concepts and theories and the things we know from a professional standpoint, but we do not bring in the expertise of an individual's life experience. We need to be in settings where we practice listening, observing, and honestly kind of calming down our urge to want to fix and intervene and help. And so in corresponding seminar class, we talk about some of those things that exist in people's situations and lives that create the problem, the presenting problem that they may be coming to see you for as a social worker. It's really important that we try to have our students not pathologize individuals, families, communities, but to understand. So they hear that often. We don't want to pathologize, we want to understand. At the end of it, they have a capstone advocacy justice project that is presented to the community in a poster presentation. If anyone was walking through the egg on Tuesday, our 6 current junior social work students were engaged in this poster presentation. And you can always reach out to me if you'd like to know the work that they were doing. All right, so some of the course objectives, again. Number 1, we want this whole experience to reiterate that this idea of that racism is ordinary and it's not an aberration. Just this morning, one of the presentations a student was giving was talking about some system issues that have them being presenting to this student with really no options available to them because of how they got funneled through some of the systemic issues. And so you got someone who's 29 years old and And because of like how they're showing up, they don't really have a lot of options. And we can't go back and redo some of this stuff. Like, this is where they are. But it's so easy without having the understanding of what came before, without having the understanding about how, yes, systems sometimes don't work on the behalf of somebody. They actually interfere with somebody. Without having that predisposition of knowing that, we can look at this person and we can get frustrated with them. We can pathologize them. Look at all the things you didn't do. You could have done this, you could have done that. And honestly, even with all of that understanding, sometimes we still think those things because we just are human, right? So we want to really bring in ordinary, not normalizing, but having this racism is ordinary, okay? I don't know how else to explain what we looked at earlier about the state of Minnesota without saying it's ordinary for people. We want to definitely make sure we're reviewing that race is socially constructed. This is not a thing. It's a thing, but it's not a thing, right? It's a thing because we've made it a thing. And so we got to make sure we keep talking about that. We want to evaluate social storytelling and counter storytelling. So it's important that we engage our students and that we're asking them, what are the people in your community, your agency, what are they saying? How are they understanding what's going on? We want to identify the environmental stressors affecting people of color. Environmental stressors, including things like history, environmental stressors like what we just looked at regarding education and healthcare and home ownership and wealth issues. We want to understand our nation's history, what's going on politically. Our students don't like it, but like politics are such a huge, there's such a huge intersection between our politics and social issues. And so we have to understand those things. So our first year community placements, we had a student with the Minnesota Community of African People with Disabilities. This particular student was helping this agency through an audit that DHS was doing. The audit concluded with a correction order being presented. In part of her poster presentation, had a copy of the letter with some identifying things crossed out. But this particular agency talked to our junior student about how she felt targeted. How, as a minority owned nonprofit within the state of Minnesota, serving a real particular East African population, to her, she did not see this as due diligence of DHS, wanting to make sure that funds are being used appropriately and responsibly. She saw this as, you're making life difficult on me. She saw this as, you're asking things of me that are impossible. She thought she had done many of the things that they were asking. There were several things that had gotten in the way of this audit just kind of sailing through and being cleared. You open up the letter, and even the letter has language that is kind of threatening or it feels scary, right? Correction order. And you will have to cease and desist if you do not do the following things by this date. So our student was there and really helping this organization navigate that, helping them with some of the filing things that had to happen. The Minnesota Migration Act, we had a student helping with this particular piece of legislation and doing some research on legislators and how they vote, and helping this organization have some information so that next year when they try to advance this legislation, they have some knowledge. This particular student was able to sit in on meetings with the community group where the lieutenant governor was present. Different Minnesota state senators and legislators were present. It was a real powerful experience for her. We had somebody with Village Arms. Village Arms is a para kind of on the side protective services advocacy group for Black families in Minneapolis. And so as CPS gets involved and they're working their case plan and treatment plan, this organization is coming alongside to advocate, to really push for due process. The student in this group had a real powerful experience of attending a court proceeding where the mother of two young siblings, the grandmother, I'm sorry, two young siblings, was trying to pursue her own foster licensure and situation. The two siblings were placed with a white family And again, this ended up in court. I don't know all the situation. Again, the idea being Village Arms wanting to support kinship placement and foster placement for these siblings with grandmother. And the student was able to see this grandmother over here with one attorney representing her, and was able to see a family over here. And this is difficult for the student to comprehend because this family was likely providing a safe situation for these siblings, but they had 5 different legal representatives over here. And she saw the inequitable balance within the Justice Center. We had a student with the Dispute Resolution Center who presented a couple weeks ago her honors project about developing trauma-informed curriculum for their restorative justice circles. We had a student at the Irreducible Grace Foundation. We had a student with the Oromo Community of Minnesota. And we had a student, we have an online adult education BSW program as well. So in Mississippi, we had a student who was partnered up with the branch, the local NAACP branch down there. Real quickly, some of the first year student experiences. Again, we talked about the trauma-informed curriculum for restorative justice circles. We had a student who led a vigil for the Minnesota Interfaith Coalition on Immigration. They hold monthly vigils, recognizing the damage and the harm done to families when they are separated and are facing deportation orders. So they hold vigils. She held a vigil and partnered up with the Center for Victims of Torture to highlight mental health realities for families. We had a student, again, assisting with the DHS audit. We had students observe court proceedings in multiple different ways. Students were able to sit in on legislative meetings. They were able to advocate with the legislators, meet with them, write letters to them, and also with CPS meetings. Less important are some of the opportunities I've had to just talk with others about what we're doing at Bethel. Again, social work education programs are going to be needing to update their curriculum and really infuse how are they engaging students in anti-racist work. And so there's some interest in what we're doing here at Bethel, and so I've had some chances to just talk about the development of a program and how we're learning and some of the mistakes we've made. Some of the questions I have going into year 2, again, how do I try to remain vigilant about decentering whiteness when, again, it seems like this whole experience is so, we have a counter narrative to that, what Resma, again, would say, that white standard, right? Development versus exposure. The goal is not simply to have students be exposed to difference, but how do we have students engaged in a continual development of an anti-racist, diverse, inclusive professional identity? How do we continue to have students take on have the lens and the umbrella of a learner in these spaces as opposed to a helper? It's just so natural to want to get in and want to help and want to fix. So how do we keep them focused on that disposition? Supervision of students, again, in our community, all of these communities, it was their first time having a student be in their setting for a whole year. So what are the different resources, guides, aids, supervision tools, reflective questions we can try to help provide to communities to really engage in conversation? All right, to close, another scripture verse that I just heard this last week and that's really been gnawing at me. John 14, 11 through 17. This is now on the other end of Jesus' ministry. And this is what he says. He says, "Believe me when I say that I am in the Father and the Father is in me, or at least believe me on the evidence of the works themselves. Very truly I tell you," and this is heavy for me. "Very truly I tell you, whoever believes in me will do the works I have been doing, and they will do even greater things than these, because I'm going to the Father. And I'll do whatever you ask in my name, so that the Father may be glorified in the Son. You may ask me for anything in my name, and I will do it. If you love me, keep my commands. And I will ask the Father, and he will give you another advocate to help you and be with you forever, the Spirit of truth. The world cannot accept him because it neither sees him nor knows him, but you know him, for he lives with you and will be in you. Whoever believes in me will do the works I have been doing, And we read at the beginning the works he was going to be doing, and they will do even greater things than these. And I was challenged this weekend with this idea that Jesus entered into the world to liberate, and then Jesus left the planet Earth, right? Left the world. And he says, you will do even greater things than these. And I can't help but think, like, what are the greater things that he's referring to here? And in America in 2023, I can't think of a greater thing that Jesus would be referring here to the sin of racism and liberation of some of this, liberation of the racist history that exists, again, and I'll just own within my profession. And so what we are praying for as a department is that the Spirit of Truth would just be empowering us and keeping us humble in our work as we dismantle the oppressive systems and structures that exist for people. I probably am over time. That was intentional so that no one would be able to ask me any questions. But right on time. I'm better than I think. So if there are questions, I don't know if it's now that I take them or if you just want to linger after and ask me, but
you can continue on if you have time.
Okay.
Parties they have, so
All right.
just have to.
all right. Maybe I'm not so smart. I should have just said I have things I have to get onto. Are there any questions people have for me? Yeah.
I don't have a question. I just want to say that I'm so inspired by the work that you're doing and how called you are to do this work for our students and for our community. I'm like deeply thankful for this opportunity to hear about what you're doing, and would love to talk to you more about how you're doing it in your classrooms because I want all of my students to take your class in the camp. So I'm gonna try to.
Well, they probably could. I mean, we should talk about that. But
Okay.
yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate that. Dr. Edie Shapolsky's not here. I want to definitely give her credit to. I definitely walked into some things, and we have there is an atmosphere in our department that says, again, let's be social workers, not educators, and so that's what we're about.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Any other questions?
I don't know if a lot of people know here, but we do have the new MSW program as well, which is just building on this work. And I'm so pleased that you talked about this today, Nick, because I said, I didn't know much about the social work department before I started working with you all. And I just am so impressed about the work that you're doing. And I think something like this helps people to understand our social work department is doing great things.
Yes.
And so I so appreciate you talking today about that, because and it's not an easy degree.
No.
Right? It's not an easy degree, right? And I think that's a misnomer too, and so I think the more that we can even help our community be aware, internal and external, what is social work at Bethel?
Yeah.
So talk about it to people you know. It is a fabulous department, and the work you're doing is so incredibly important, so thanks for talking about this today.
Yeah, thank you. All right. Thank you all.